Steve Harvey went off script after a contestant made a racist joke, and the whole room went silent. But this wasn't just an awkward moment on a game show that would be forgotten by tomorrow. What happened in those few seconds exposed something that millions of people have been hiding their entire lives: the invisible, exhausting burden of code switching. The burden of constantly modifying who you are, how you speak, what you laugh at, just to survive in spaces that were never built for you. And in this video, we're going to explore the moment that forced everyone to stop pretending it doesn't exist. There exists a particular kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep can ever remedy. It's the fatigue that accumulates when you spend your entire life inhabiting multiple versions of yourself. When you're constantly calibrating your tone, your expressions, your very essence, all to fit the room you're standing in. This is the invisible burden that Steve Harvey carries every single day. Not visible to the millions who watch him on television. Not apparent in the accolades and achievements that line his career. But deeply, intimately familiar to him in the moments when the performance becomes so automatic that he forgets he's even wearing a mask. On the surface, Steve Harvey is a man who has transcended limitations. Born into poverty in Cleveland, Ohio, he rose from nothing to become one of the most recognizable television personalities in America. His laugh is infectious. His timing is impeccable. His ability to connect with an audience feels almost supernatural in its ease. Millions of people tune in to watch him host game shows, to hear him deliver relationship advice, to listen to him share motivational wisdom. They see a man who seems entirely comfortable in his own skin, effortlessly commanding rooms, making split-second decisions that land perfectly with audiences. But what those millions of viewers do not see is the constant negotiation happening beneath the surface. Steve Harvey has spent decades learning to code switch. It's a term that's becoming more common, but most people still don't truly understand what it means or what it costs. Code switching is the psychological and social practice of modifying your behavior, your language, your presentation, depending on the context, depending on who's in the room with you. For a black man in the entertainment industry, code switching is not a choice. It is survival. It is the price of entry into spaces that were never originally designed to welcome him. It is the skill that has allowed him to build an empire while navigating an industry rife with racial dynamics. Dynamics that remain unspoken, but absolutely omnipresent. Think about it this way. When you're in a room where people look like you, where the systems are built by and for people like you, you don't have to think about how you come across. You don't have to monitor every word, every gesture, every laugh. You just exist. But when you're the only one, when you're in a space not built for you, when your very presence requires explanation or justification, then you become hyper-aware. You monitor everything. You calculate. You adjust. You learn to read the room before you even enter it. That's code switching. And for Harvey, it had become so ingrained, so deeply embedded in his nervous system, that he barely recognized it as a choice anymore. It was simply how he moved through the world. The morning of the taping, Harvey arrived at the studio with the practiced ease of someone who has done this thousands of times. The studio is a controlled environment, climate-controlled, brightly lit, filled with the careful orchestration of entertainment production. The set is familiar, so familiar that he could navigate it with his eyes closed. The production crew knows his preferences before he even articulates them. The audience has been carefully selected and briefed on how to respond. Everything is designed for maximum entertainment value and minimal complications. But as Harvey settled into his chair and began reviewing the day's contestants, He couldn't shake a subtle undercurrent of tension, a tension that seemed to permeate everything lately. The entertainment industry was changing. Conversations about race, about representation, about accountability. These conversations were becoming impossible to ignore. A moment that once might have been forgotten could now live forever in the digital archive. Dissected, recontextualized, weaponized. Harvey understood this better than most. He had navigated the treacherous waters of racial comedy for much of his career. Early on, he had relied on humor that played with racial stereotypes, humor that allowed white audiences to laugh alongside him while simultaneously othering him and his community. He had made compromises. He had softened his rough edges for mainstream audiences. He had learned to never make white audiences too uncomfortable. Over time, he had evolved. His comedy had matured. His platforms had multiplied. But the memory of those earlier performances lingered. Those compromises made in service of advancement. Those moments when he had laughed at jokes he found offensive. Those times when he had remained silent in the face of discrimination because speaking up would have cost him. This is the nature of code switching in entertainment. You learn to be what the market demands. You learn to make white audiences comfortable with your presence by never making them too uncomfortable with your reality. You learn to perform excellence in a way that doesn't threaten, doesn't challenge, doesn't demand too much emotional labor from those watching. And somewhere in that process, you lose track of where the performance ends and the authentic self begins. Harvey had made peace with much of this long ago. He had built a career on his ability to navigate these spaces with grace and humor. He had earned his position not through earned confrontation, but through competence, charm, and an almost preternatural ability to read a room and give people exactly what they wanted to see. These were valuable skills. They had served him extraordinarily well. But in recent years, something had shifted inside him. Perhaps it was age. Perhaps it was the cumulative weight of decades spent managing other people's comfort at the expense of his own authenticity. Perhaps it was the cultural moment itself, a moment when silence had become increasingly indefensible. When standing on the sidelines was no longer a neutral position, but a choice with moral implications. Harvey had begun to feel the cracks forming in the performance. Not visible cracks, nothing obvious, but internal fractures. Moments where maintaining the mask required more energy than he had to give. Moments where he questioned whether the performance was still worth the cost. The studio audience had filled in around 10 in the morning, as they did for each taping. They were ordinary people, a cross-section of the city. Some were fans of the show. Some were just looking for an entertaining day out. Some had come with friends or family, excited about the possibility of winning money or being part of the live experience. They had been told to arrive early, to be energetic, to be ready to laugh and cheer on cue. The atmosphere was one of controlled excitement. This is what entertainment is. It's controlled. It's designed. Everything has its place. Harvey arrived at his mark with 5 minutes to spare before taping began. He had a routine that he had never consciously articulated to anyone. He would stand just off stage and center himself. He would take a few deep breaths. He would mentally prepare himself for the role he was about to inhabit. The role of Steve Harvey, the consummate entertainer, the man who had figured out how to be successful in a system not built for him. The man who could walk into any room and immediately make people feel comfortable. The man who could laugh off tension, who could charm his way through any awkward moment. This routine was not something he had ever written down or talked about. It was simply what he did. It was the transition from one version of himself to another, from the Steve Harvey who existed in private, who had doubts, who carried awareness of the compromises he had made, who sometimes felt the weight of decades of performance. To the Steve Harvey that millions of people knew and loved. The distinction between these two versions was not as simple as on stage versus off stage. The performance had become so habitual, so deeply embedded in his daily existence, that the boundaries had blurred to the point where they were almost imperceptible. When was he being authentic? When was he performing? Could he even distinguish anymore? This is one of the deepest costs of code switching. Over time, the practice can fracture your sense of self. You become so skilled at inhabiting different versions of yourself in different contexts that you begin to lose the thread of who you actually are underneath it all. The masks you wear become so comfortable, so familiar, that you might forget you're wearing them at all. You might wake up one day and realize that you've spent 30 years performing, and you can't quite remember what authenticity felt like. As the audience applauded his entrance and the opening theme music played, Harvey settled into the familiar groove. The energy was good. The audience was responsive. Everything was moving according to script. He welcomed the first few contestants with practiced warmth. He asked the appropriate questions. He set up the games. He delivered the jokes with perfect timing. Harvey had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people quickly. In the first few seconds of interaction, he could assess personality, comfort level, sense of humor, insecurity, confidence, everything. He could determine instantly how to make them feel at ease, how to bring them into the entertainment, how to make them part of the show. This skill had become so automatic that it barely registered as conscious thought. It was pure instinct born from thousands of hours of practice. The studio audience responded as they always did. They laughed at his jokes. They cheered when contestants won. They booed when answers were wrong. They gasped at dramatic moments. They were, in essence, playing their part in the carefully orchestrated production. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew what was expected. The show proceeded with the smooth efficiency of something that had been perfected through hundreds of repetitions. But this particular day, this particular taping, would deviate from the script in a way that would test everything Harvey had learned about code switching, and everything he believed about his own ability to manage moments of racial tension. The third contestant of the day arrived with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to second-guess yourself. His name doesn't matter. What matters is the energy he brought into the studio. A certain swagger. A certain assumption that the world would receive him exactly as he presented himself. No modifications necessary. No code switching required. This is a privilege that not everyone possesses. The ability to walk into a room and assume that your presence is welcome, that your jokes will land the way you intend them, that people will interpret your words charitably, that you won't have to spend mental energy calculating how your behavior might be perceived through a lens of prejudice or stereotype. Harvey had spent enough time around people with this kind of privilege to recognize it instantly. It was visible in the contestant's posture, in the way he greeted Harvey with a casual familiarity that suggested he assumed they were peers, in the way he seemed entirely unburdened by any awareness that his presence in this space might require any special consideration or management. From Harvey's perspective, this was information, important information, because Harvey had learned long ago that people who move through the world with this kind of unexamined confidence are often the ones who are most likely to say something that reveals the underlying assumptions they carry about people who don't look like them, not necessarily out of malice, often out of genuine obliviousness. They say things that they believe are harmless because they've never had to consider how those words might land on someone from a different background. Someone who has heard those same words countless times. Someone who understands the historical weight they carry. Harvey settled the contestant into his chair and began the preliminary banter that always preceded the game. This was his domain, the space where he controlled the narrative, where he set the tone, where he determined how the interaction would unfold. He asked the standard questions. Where are you from? What do you do? Do you have family here? Are you excited to play? The contestant answered with an easy confidence. He was self-employed. He was here with friends. He'd watched the show before and was excited to compete. Everything was normal. Everything was proceeding exactly as it always did. The audience was engaged. The energy was good. The studio felt alive with the particular electricity that comes when people are gathered together for entertainment. When there's the possibility of real stakes, real money, real excitement. Harvey had learned to read this energy with precision. He understood exactly what the audience wanted at any given moment. When they wanted excitement, when they wanted humor, when they wanted pathos, when they wanted to feel smart or clever or connected to what was happening on stage. He could modulate his performance to give them exactly what they needed. This is part of what had made him so successful. His ability to be responsive to an audience, to adjust in real time, to sense when energy was flagging and inject new excitement, to sense when things were getting too intense and provide relief through humor. It's a skill that requires constant monitoring, constant awareness, constant calculation. You have to be present and engaged while simultaneously maintaining enough distance from the moment to analyze it, to assess it, to determine your next move based on how people are responding to your current one. This is exhausting. Most people don't realize how much mental and emotional energy goes into this kind of performance. They see the final product, the polished television broadcast, the confident host who seems to glide effortlessly through interactions. What they don't see is the constant internal calculation happening beneath the surface. The monitoring of tone, the reading of faces, the adjustment of approach based on subtle shifts in audience response. The awareness that one wrong move, one misplaced joke, one moment of authenticity that feels too real could disrupt the entire carefully constructed entertainment experience. As Harvey proceeded through the opening of the game with this particular contestant, he maintained this level of awareness. But there was something else beneath it, a subtle tension that he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was intuition. Perhaps it was experience. Perhaps it was simply the cumulative awareness of living in a racialized body, in a space that required constant negotiation. Whatever it was, Harvey sensed that this particular interaction carried a different energy than most. It wasn't overt. Nothing the contestant had said or done was overtly problematic. On the surface, everything was fine. Everything was normal. Everything was proceeding as expected. But there was an undercurrent, a sense that this person felt entitled to a certain level of comfort, that he assumed his presence here was non-threatening, that he believed he could say whatever he wanted without consequence. Harvey had encountered this dynamic countless times before. It was the dynamic that emerged when someone with racial privilege encountered someone without it in a space where the person without privilege was nominally in control, where the person without privilege was the host, the authority figure, the person determining the parameters of the interaction. But beneath that surface authority was a deeper reality. This person could say almost anything and face minimal consequences. This person's words would be interpreted charitably by most of the audience. This person didn't have to worry that something he said carelessly would be used as evidence of his character, as proof that he was dangerous, as justification for discrimination or exclusion. Harvey understood this dynamic intimately. He had navigated it his entire career. way to manage it was to maintain control of the space, to set boundaries, to keep things light, to keep things entertainment-focused, to never let the conversation venture into territory where the contestant might feel comfortable enough to reveal the unchallenged assumptions he carried. So Harvey kept the conversation moving. He asked questions that required simple answers. He steered toward the game itself. He maintained a genial demeanor that was warm but also clearly professional. That kept things at the appropriate distance. This is code switching, though Harvey never thought of it in those terms. This is what code switching looks like in practice. It's the constant management of other people's comfort, the constant calibration of your own personality to fit the parameters of the space, the constant awareness that authenticity might disrupt things, that being too real, too direct, too honest about what you're observing could make people uncomfortable. So you stay in control. You stay professional. You stay in the role that's been assigned to you. The audience seemed engaged as the game progressed. The first round went smoothly. The contestant answered questions. He won some money. He was energetic and playful in the way the format encouraged. Everything was unfolding exactly as it should. Harvey maintained his performance. The practiced warmth, the perfectly timed jokes, the responses that were scripted even when they felt spontaneous. The constant awareness of where the camera was, where the audience was, how his face would read on television. This is the performance that millions of people see every single day. And it's a masterclass in code switching. Because what Harvey is doing is presenting a version of himself that is specifically designed to be non-threatening to white audiences while remaining entertaining and relatable to black audiences. He's being warm without being too familiar, professional without being cold, funny without being threatening, successful without making anyone uncomfortable about the barriers he had to overcome to achieve that success. It's a delicate balance, one that he had perfected over decades, one that had served him extraordinarily well. But maintaining this balance requires energy, constant energy, the kind of energy that accumulates into exhaustion over time. And somewhere in the back of Harvey's mind, even as he was performing flawlessly, he was aware of that exhaustion, that weight, that sense that he was carrying something that no one in the audience truly understood. The second round of the game began. The contestant was doing well. He had won a decent amount of money. The stakes were rising. The energy in the studio was building toward a crescendo. This is where Harvey's skill really came into play. Maintaining momentum, building excitement, keeping the audience on the edge of their seats. He was doing all of this with apparent ease. But beneath the surface, he was monitoring everything. He was reading the contestant's body language, assessing his confidence level, determining whether he was likely to take risks or play it safe with his winnings. He was reading the audience, sensing where their energy was, gauging whether they were invested in this particular contestant or whether their attention was starting to wane. He was managing his own presence, making sure he was commanding the stage without overshadowing the contestant, making sure the focus remained on the game and the stakes and the possibility of winning. This is the invisible labor of entertainment. This is what code switching looks like when it's performed at the highest level. You become so skilled at reading a room, at adjusting your approach, at managing the dynamics, that you can do it while making it look completely effortless. Most people would never know how much calculation was happening. Most people would just see a charismatic host doing what hosts do. They wouldn't see the constant monitoring. They wouldn't see the management of multiple narratives simultaneously. They wouldn't see the exhaustion that accumulates when you've been doing this for 40 years. The game continued toward its climax. The contestant had accumulated a significant amount of money. The final question was approaching. The moment where he would either walk away with his winnings or risk it all for a chance at more. These are the moments Harvey lived for. These are the moments where the drama felt genuine, where the stakes felt real, where the outcome wasn't predetermined. These were the moments where the performance became almost irrelevant, because the genuine stakes of the game itself created the dramatic tension. Harvey asked the penultimate question. The contestant answered correctly. The audience cheered. Harvey congratulated him and moved toward the final question. This is where things shifted. Not immediately, not in any obvious way. But there was a subtle change in the contestant's demeanor, a loosening of tension, a sense that he had proven himself, that he had succeeded in whatever internal competition he was waging. And with that success came a different kind of energy, a more relaxed energy, a more comfortable energy. The kind of energy that sometimes emerges when people feel they've established their position, their status, their right to be in a space. Harvey recognized this energy. He'd seen it before. And he knew from experience that it was sometimes the moment right before someone said something they shouldn't. The moment where they felt comfortable enough to reveal assumptions they normally kept hidden, to crack jokes they wouldn't normally make, to test boundaries they normally respected. Harvey felt a tension rising in his chest, a subtle alarm, a sense that something was about to happen. The kind of intuition that comes from decades of navigating spaces where your presence required constant negotiation, constant management, constant awareness. He proceeded with the final question anyway, because that's what the show demanded, because that's what the audience expected, because stopping now would require explanation, would require breaking character, would require acknowledging the tension that only he seemed to be feeling. So he asked the final question. The contestant smiled, and then he said something that would change the entire trajectory of the day. It happened in a fraction of a second, a moment so brief that most people in the studio almost missed it. A joke, a single sentence, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who believed it was harmless entertainment. But it wasn't harmless. And the moment it left the contestant's mouth, everything changed. The joke relied on a racial stereotype, the kind of stereotype that has been used to dehumanize black people for centuries, the kind that reduces complex human beings to caricatures, to punchlines, to justifications for discrimination and exclusion. It was brief enough that some people might convince themselves they had misheard it. It was casual enough that someone might argue it was just a joke. It was familiar enough that most people in the audience had probably heard variations of it before. But it was unmistakably racist. And in that moment, the entire dynamic of the space shifted. The studio didn't erupt into chaos. There was no dramatic outburst. What happened instead was something more profound. There was silence. Not the comfortable silence of a moment of contemplation, not the anticipatory silence of waiting for what comes next, but a silence that carries weight, that carries awareness, that carries the sudden, collective realization that something has gone wrong. The audience felt it, the crew felt it, the cameras felt it, and Harvey felt it most acutely of all. In that fraction of a second between the joke and the silence, something crystallized inside of him. All the years of code switching, all the compromises, all the moments where he had remained silent in the face of racism because speaking up would have disrupted the performance. All the times he had laughed at jokes he found offensive because that's what was required to maintain control of the space. All of it rushed up to meet him in that moment. The mask flickered, just for an instant, just for a fraction of a second. But it was visible. people who were paying attention. And in that moment, everyone was paying attention. Could see something authentic break through. Could see the real Steve Harvey, the one who was exhausted, the one who was angry, the one who was tired of performing. The contestant didn't notice. He was still riding the high of his success in the game, still feeling the confidence that comes from winning, still assuming that his joke would land the way he intended it, still operating under the assumption that he could say whatever he wanted without consequence. The audience noticed. The silence deepened. It became almost palpable, almost suffocating. The kind of silence that creates space for what comes next, that demands something, that refuses to let the moment pass without acknowledgement. Harvey took a breath, and in that breath, he made a choice that, in retrospect, would seem inevitable. But in that moment was anything but. He could have let it pass. He had let things pass before, many times, countless times. He had the skill, the practiced ease, the ability to deflect with humor, to smooth over the moment, to move the show forward and pretend the joke had never been made. He could have code-switched in a different direction. Instead of performing authenticity, he could have performed forgiveness, could have performed the role of the gracious host who can handle anything, who can rise above, who can maintain professionalism in the face of unprofessionalism. That would have been the safer choice. The choice that wouldn't disrupt the show. The choice that wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. The choice that had defined much of his career. But in that moment, something inside him refused. Not violently, not dramatically, but with a quiet, unmistakable clarity. He was done. Done code-switching. Done performing. Done protecting everyone else's comfort at the expense of his own dignity. The realization didn't come with fanfare. It came quietly. It came from a place of deep exhaustion. It came from decades of accumulated weight, finally reaching a breaking point. Harvey looked at the contestant, and his face was different. The practiced smile was gone. The warmth had been replaced with something more direct, more real, more honest. The contestant felt the shift. He could see it in Harvey's eyes, in the set of his jaw, in the way his entire body had tensed. He realized, in that moment, that the joke had not landed the way he intended, that something had gone wrong, that he had miscalculated. But he didn't yet understand how badly. The studio was completely silent now. The audience had gone still, not the comfortable stillness of anticipation, but the stillness that comes when people realize they are witnessing something real, something unscripted, something that breaks through the carefully constructed performance and reveals genuine emotion underneath. Harvey took another breath, and then he spoke. His voice was different. It lacked the performed warmth, the calculated friendliness, the professional distance that normally characterized his interactions. Instead, it carried something harder, something more direct, something that came from a place of genuine feeling rather than strategic performance. He named what had happened. He didn't dance around it, didn't use coded language, didn't perform the role of the gracious host who can handle anything. He simply stated the fact. That was racist. 4 words. Simple, direct, undeniable. In that moment, everything the contestant had assumed about his safety in that space, his ability to say whatever he wanted without consequence, evaporated. He was no longer in a space where his privilege protected him. He was in a space where someone with actual power was refusing to protect his comfort. The audience felt the shift. Some people looked uncomfortable. Some people looked relieved. Some people looked shocked. But everyone looked aware. Everyone understood that they were witnessing something that didn't normally happen on television. Something that didn't fit the script. Something that revealed the underlying dynamics that the performance usually managed to conceal. The contestant tried to recover. He tried to laugh it off, to suggest that Harvey had misunderstood, to recontextualize the joke as something harmless. But Harvey didn't allow it. He refused to participate in the process of reframing, of minimizing, of protecting the contestant from the consequences of what he had said. Instead, he held the line. He maintained the directness, the authenticity, the refusal to code switch back into the performance that would make everyone comfortable. This refusal was itself a form of power. Not the power of status or position or control of the environment, but the power of authenticity, the power of someone refusing to perform, the power of someone choosing their own dignity over the comfort of others. The contestant began to understand what was happening. He was being held accountable, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that involved punishment or removal from the stage, but in a way that was far more profound. He was being forced to confront the reality of what he had said, to recognize that his joke had landed exactly as it was designed to land, that it had revealed exactly what he carried internally, that there was no way to reframe it or minimize it or make it acceptable. The silence in the studio deepened. It became almost unbearable. The kind of silence that forces people to sit with discomfort, that doesn't allow them to escape into distraction or performance, or the comfortable narratives that usually manage moments of tension. The cameras were still rolling. The audience was still watching. Everything was being recorded. Everything was being documented. Everything was being preserved for the moment when it would be broadcast. When millions of people would watch this moment, when they would see what happened when someone refused to code switch. Harvey stood in that silence, completely present, completely real, completely refusing to perform his way out of it. And in that refusal was the answer to everything the video would explore, the answer to what code switching costs, the answer to why moments like this matter so much, the answer to what it looks like when someone finally says enough. The contestant was still trying to recover, still trying to manage the situation, still trying to find the words that would make Harvey understand his intentions, that would convince the audience that he had meant no harm, that would restore the comfortable dynamic of entertainment and performance. But those words didn't exist, because the moment had moved beyond the realm of intention into the realm of impact. Harvey had named the impact, and in naming it, he had refused to allow it to be reframed or minimized or explained away. The joke hung in the air, undeniable, unmistakable, unmistakably racist, and Harvey's refusal to pretend otherwise was itself a kind of power, a kind of authenticity that had been absent from the performance until that moment. The crew members were looking at each other with expressions of shock. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't how the show was supposed to proceed. This wasn't the careful management of moments that kept everything running smoothly. But the show was proceeding, just not in the way anyone had anticipated. Harvey kept his gaze fixed on the contestant, completely present, completely real, completely refusing to look away or smooth things over or perform his way out of the moment. And the contestant, for the first time since the show began, was experiencing genuine consequence. Not punishment. Not removal or public shaming or professional destruction, but the simple, profound consequence of being seen, of having his words reflected back to him without the protective layer of performance that normally allows people to say racist things while maintaining a sense of themselves as good people. This is what happens when someone refuses to code switch. This is what it looks like when someone chooses authenticity over performance, dignity over comfort, truth over entertainment. The silence stretched on. A second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. In television time, it felt like an eternity. In human time, it was the length of a breath, a moment where everything pivoted, where the comfortable performance that had been running seamlessly since the show began suddenly revealed itself as a performance, where the real dynamics, the power relations, the racial dynamics, the exhaustion that comes from constant code switching became visible. The contestant was beginning to understand the depth of what had happened. He was beginning to realize that there was no way to recover from this, no way to perform his way out of it, no way to use charm or humor or assumed goodwill to restore the situation to its previous equilibrium, because Harvey had refused to allow it. Harvey had chosen, in that moment, to be real rather than perform. And that choice had changed everything. What happened in the seconds after Harvey refused to code switch was something that most people in the studio had never witnessed before. They had never seen someone with power choose authenticity over performance. They had never seen someone refuse to smooth over a moment of racial tension with humor or charm, or the practiced ease of someone accustomed to managing discomfort. They had never seen what it looked like when someone stopped protecting everyone else's feelings and simply spoke the truth. The silence in the studio was no longer just silence. It had become a presence, a thing unto itself, something that demanded acknowledgement, something that refused to be ignored or minimized or moved past. Harvey stood completely still. His body language had shifted entirely from what it had been moments before. The practiced ease was gone. The performed confidence had evaporated. What remained was something harder, something more direct, something that came from a place of genuine feeling rather than strategic positioning. He was not performing anger. He was not performing outrage. He was simply present with his own authentic response to what had been said. And that presence was more powerful than any performance could have been. The contestant was beginning to truly understand what had happened. Not just that he had made a mistake, but that his mistake had consequences, real consequences, that his words had landed exactly as they were designed to land, that there was no way to recontextualize them, no way to suggest he had been misunderstood, no way to perform his way out of accountability. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Because what could he say? He could apologize. But apologies, in this moment, would feel hollow, would feel like an attempt to manage the situation rather than a genuine reckoning with what he had done. He could explain his intentions. But intentions, in this moment, were irrelevant. The impact was what mattered. The fact that he had revealed, in a moment of careless confidence, the assumptions he carried, the prejudices he harbored, the casual dehumanization he felt entitled to express. He could try to minimize the joke. But Harvey had already named it, had already refused to allow it to be minimized, had already established that they were not going to pretend this was something smaller than it was. So the contestant remained silent. And in his silence was his own reckoning, his own dawning awareness that the world he inhabited, the world where he could say racist things without consequence, had suddenly shifted. That his privilege, which had felt so absolute, had suddenly revealed itself as contingent, dependent on the cooperation of people around him to maintain the fiction that his words were acceptable. And Harvey was no longer cooperating. The audience was watching all of this with an intensity that bordered on physical. Some members of the audience were black. They were experiencing something complicated, a sense of vindication, perhaps, a sense that someone with platform and power was finally saying what they had all been thinking, that someone was finally refusing to smooth over racism with a smile and a joke. But there was also a sense of danger, a sense that this moment could spiral in unpredictable ways, a sense that Harvey was taking a risk, that by refusing to code switch, by refusing to protect the comfort of others, he was stepping into territory that could have real consequences for him. Other members of the audience were white, and they were experiencing something different. Some felt uncomfortable. Some felt defensive. Some felt ashamed. Some felt a sense that they were witnessing something that revealed uncomfortable truths about the world they inhabited, about the privilege they carried, about the assumptions that were baked into their sense of normalcy. The production crew was frozen. They didn't know what to do. The show had deviated from script in a way that was unprecedented. Their jobs were to keep things running smoothly, to manage moments, to ensure that the broadcast remained entertaining and appropriate, and didn't veer into territory that might be controversial. But this moment was already controversial. And trying to manage it, trying to smooth it over, would only emphasize how real the moment was, how authentic it was, how much it mattered. So they remained frozen, waiting to see what Harvey would do next, because Harvey was in control now. Not in the way he had been before, through performance and charm and the careful management of entertainment, but in a deeper way, through the power of someone refusing to perform, through the power of authentic presence, through the power of someone who had decided that their dignity mattered more than the comfort of others. Harvey's gaze remained fixed on the contestant. He was not angry in a way that was performed for the camera. He was simply present with his own authentic response, and that presence carried weight. It carried the weight of 40 years of code switching, the weight of countless moments where Harvey had remained silent in the face of racism because speaking up would have disrupted the performance, the weight of compromises made in service of advancement, the weight of an entire career spent managing other people's comfort at the expense of his own authenticity. All of that weight was present in this moment. All of it was visible in the way Harvey stood, in the expression on his face, in the directness of his gaze. The contestant was shrinking under that gaze. Not physically. His body remained in the same position. But in every other way, he was shrinking. His confidence was evaporating. His sense of entitlement was dissolving. His ability to assume that his words were acceptable was being revealed as an illusion. This is what happens when the protective mechanisms of privilege are suddenly removed. When someone refuses to cooperate in the maintenance of the fiction that allows people to say racist things while maintaining a sense of themselves as good people. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds now. 10 seconds. The kind of silence that feels impossible in television, that feels like a violation of every rule about pacing and momentum and keeping an audience engaged. But the audience was engaged. More engaged than they had been at any other moment in the show. Because they were witnessing something real, something that broke through the performance and revealed the underlying dynamics. The cameras continued to roll. Everything was being documented. Everything was being preserved. Everything was being recorded for the moment when this moment would become public. When millions of people would watch it. When they would see what happened when someone refused to code switch. Harvey finally spoke again. His voice was still direct, still carrying the absence of performed warmth. He addressed the contestant directly. He asked if the contestant understood why that joke was problematic. Not in a condescending way, not in a way that was designed to humiliate or shame, but in a way that demanded genuine engagement, that refused to allow the moment to pass without real acknowledgement. The contestant opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He was struggling to find words, struggling to articulate understanding of something he had probably never truly considered before. Because for people who carry racial privilege, the impact of racist jokes is often abstract. It's something that other people experience, something that happens to communities, not to individuals, something that is easy to minimize or rationalize or explain away. But in this moment, the contestant was being forced to confront the reality of what he had said, to recognize that it wasn't abstract, that it had impact, that there was a real human being standing in front of him who was experiencing that impact. And that real human being was refusing to smooth things over. The contestant finally managed to speak. He offered a weak apology, something that was less an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and more an attempt to manage the situation. A diplomatic statement designed to restore equilibrium. But Harvey didn't accept it. Not because the words were insincere, though they were, but because accepting the apology would require him to code switch back into the role that had defined his career. It would require him to perform forgiveness, to perform the role of the gracious host who can handle anything, to perform the role of the person willing to manage everyone else's comfort. And he was done with that. So he remained present, remained direct, remained unwilling to perform his way out of the moment. And the studio remained suspended in a moment of genuine tension, genuine conflict, genuine refusal to perform. This is what code switching looks like when it's absent. This is what happens when someone stops managing other people's comfort and simply insists on their own dignity. The contestant was beginning to understand the depth of what had happened. Not just that he had made a mistake, but that his mistake had revealed something about himself that he was now being forced to confront. That the world he inhabited, the world where he could say racist things without consequence, was not as stable as he had believed. That his privilege, which had felt so absolute, was actually dependent on the cooperation of other people. And that cooperation could be withdrawn. The production staff was looking increasingly uncomfortable. They were aware, in a way they hadn't been before, of the fact that this moment was real, that it was going to be broadcast, that millions of people were going to watch this, that the show they had worked so hard to produce and manage had suddenly become something they couldn't control. But that was the point. That was the entire point of what was happening. That sometimes authenticity cannot be controlled. That sometimes genuine emotion and genuine conflict break through the protective mechanisms of performance. That sometimes someone refuses to manage everyone else's comfort and simply insists on being seen. Harvey looked at the contestant one more time. And in that look was everything. Was the exhaustion of 40 years of code switching. Was the recognition of the cost of maintaining performance for so long. Was the decision to stop paying that cost. Was the power that comes from someone refusing to perform. The contestant dropped his gaze. And in that dropping of his gaze was his own understanding that the dynamic had fundamentally shifted, that he was no longer in a space where his privilege protected him, that he was in a space where someone with actual power was refusing to participate in the maintenance of his comfort. The silence settled over the studio once again, but it was a different silence now. Not the silence of anticipation, not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of something having fundamentally shifted. The silence of a moment that could not be reversed, that could not be performed away. that would forever remain as evidence of what happened when someone refused to code switch. The show continued, but everything had changed. The audience's applause for the contestant's victory was muted. The energy in the studio had shifted. The comfortable rhythm of entertainment had been disrupted by authenticity. Harvey proceeded with professionalism, but his performance was different now, more measured, more real, less automatic. The remaining contestants sensed it. They were more cautious, more aware that their words carried weight. The carefully constructed safety of the performance had been stripped away. The crew whispered about what they had witnessed. Some felt Harvey had been right. Others thought he'd gone too far. But everyone agreed. Something significant had happened. During the break, Harvey retreated to his dressing room alone. The adrenaline faded, replaced by something heavier. He was beginning to understand the cost of refusing to code switch. For 40 years, he had managed everyone else's comfort at the expense of his authenticity. He had laughed at offensive jokes. He had remained silent. He had performed acceptability. And in that one moment, he had chosen not to anymore. Not strategically, authentically. He sat in the silence and felt the weight of it. Later, Harvey watched the footage. He saw the moment when the performed warmth evaporated. He saw authenticity break through. He saw power, not the power of position, but the power of someone refusing to perform. The production company debated whether to broadcast it. But there was consensus. This moment was too real to ignore. Harvey's decision to broadcast meant stepping outside the protective mechanisms of entertainment. It meant being vulnerable on a massive scale. But it also meant validating every person who had ever code switched. Every person who had felt the exhaustion of managing their authenticity for others' comfort. In the days ahead, Harvey would face praise and criticism. The moment would spark debates about race, code switching, and authenticity. But in that dressing room, he simply sat with what had happened. With the recognition that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. With the understanding that refusing to code switch came with consequences. But also with the knowledge that not refusing would have cost him something that mattered more: his dignity.